There are 17 years of Gandalf's life that Tolkien deliberately hid from us. 17 years where the most powerful wizard in Middle-earth simply vanished. The Fellowship knows about his research into the ring's history. They know he traveled to Gondor, searched ancient archives, consulted with Saruman. But here's what's chilling. Tolkien wrote detailed timelines for almost everything in Middle-earth. He tracked the movements of kings, the migration of peoples, the phases of the moon. But for 17 crucial years, from when Gandalf first suspected Bilbo's ring until he returned to confirm the truth, the professor went completely silent. Today, we're going to uncover what Gandalf was really doing during those missing years. And I promise you, it's far more terrifying than any research trip to Minas Tirith. Because what Gandalf discovered wasn't just the ring's history, it was the horrifying scope of how close Middle-earth had already come to falling into shadow. Now, most fans assume those 17 years were just research time. Gandalf being thorough, checking sources, making sure he had the facts right before alarming everyone about the ring. But here's the thing about Tolkien's writing. He never left gaps by accident. Every missing detail, every unexplained absence, every moment of silence in his histories was deliberate. The professor was obsessively detailed about things that mattered. So when he deliberately obscures 17 years of Gandalf's most crucial period, we need to ask why. In Letter 144, Tolkien mentions that Gandalf's investigation of the ring took him to many dark places, both literally and metaphorically. Dark places. Not libraries, not archives. Dark places. And in the appendices to Return of the King, there's one line that most readers skip right over. In those years, Gandalf was often away on errands that he would not name, and his face grew ever more troubled. Errands he would not name. Why wouldn't Gandalf, who shared almost everything with the wise, refuse to speak about these particular missions? Because what he found during those 17 years would have shattered the peace of everyone who heard it. Let's start with what we know happened during year 1 of Gandalf's investigation. According to The Hunt for the Ring in Unfinished Tales, Gandalf began by testing Bilbo's ring with fire. The letters appeared, the ring was revealed, and that's when everything changed. But here's what most people miss about Gandalf's methodology. He didn't just head straight to Minas Tirith's archives like some medieval librarian. No, the Grey Wizard understood something crucial about investigation. You don't go looking for answers until you know what questions to ask. So first, Gandalf did something absolutely brilliant. He returned to Isengard. Picture this. Gandalf standing before Saruman, the head of their order, with the weight of cosmic horror fresh on his shoulders. But he doesn't reveal what he's discovered. Instead, he probes. He asks subtle questions about ring lore, about the history of Isildur, about the nature of the ruling ring. And with each question, Gandalf is watching Saruman's responses, cataloguing every micro-expression, every pause, every deflection. Because Gandalf has realized something terrifying. If Sauron has been this active for this long, then someone on the White Council might already be compromised, and he needs to know who he can trust before he reveals the full scope of what he's discovered. This is detective work at the highest level. Gandalf isn't just researching ring lore, he's conducting counterintelligence operations against the very people he's supposed to trust most. Only after satisfying himself that Saruman's corruption isn't yet complete does Gandalf finally make his way to Minas Tirith. And when he arrives at those archives, he doesn't just start reading randomly. The Mithrandir has a systematic approach that would make modern intelligence analysts weep with admiration. First, he goes straight to the scroll of Isildur. Not the public records that everyone knows about, but Isildur's personal account of the ring's properties. And here's where Gandalf's brilliance shows. He doesn't just read what Isildur wrote, he analyzes what Isildur deliberately didn't write. You see, Tolkien tells us that Isildur's account was much damaged and hard to read. But Gandalf realizes that some of that damage isn't from age. It's deliberate. Isildur had scratched out certain passages, burned specific sections, literally tried to erase parts of his own testimony. Why would the King of Gondor censor his own private records? Because what Isildur discovered about the ring was so horrifying that he couldn't bear to leave it for posterity. But Gandalf, with the enhanced perception of the Maya, can read what was erased. He can see the burn patterns, decipher the scratched-out words, reconstruct the testimony that Isildur tried to destroy. And that's when Gandalf discovers the first piece of truly terrifying evidence. Isildur didn't just fail to destroy the ring because he was corrupted by its power. He failed because the ring was actively communicating with Sauron the entire time they were in Mount Doom. Every moment of Isildur's claiming the ring, every second of his supposed triumph, Sauron was there. Listening, influencing, preparing. The Dark Lord had been inside Mount Doom, inside Isildur's mind, watching his enemies celebrate their victory while he planned his return. But that's just the beginning of what Gandalf finds in those archives. Because once he knows what to look for, once he understands that Sauron has been actively engaged this entire time, other records start revealing their hidden truths. The disaster of the Gladden Fields wasn't just an ambush by orcs, it was a precisely orchestrated operation. Gandalf finds shipping records, troop movements, supply line disruptions, all perfectly timed to ensure Isildur would be traveling that specific route at that specific time with minimal protection. Sauron didn't just wait for opportunities to reclaim his ring, he created them. Because the moment those letters blazed in the firelight, Gandalf didn't just realize Bilbo had the One Ring. He realized something far worse. Sauron had been active, intelligent, and planning for decades, while the wise thought him weakened and leaderless in Dol Guldur. The ring's very existence meant the Dark Lord had never been as defeated as they believed, which meant everything, every victory, every moment of peace, every assumption about Middle-earth's safety was built on a lie. Picture Gandalf in that moment. The firelight fades, the letters disappear, and he's standing in Bag End with the weight of cosmic horror settling on his shoulders. Because now he has to answer the question that will haunt him for 17 years. If Sauron was this active, this intelligent, this capable of long-term planning, what else had the wise missed? What other shadows had been growing while they congratulated themselves on their vigilance? This is where Tolkien's gap becomes terrifying, because Gandalf didn't spend 17 years just researching the ring's history. He spent 17 years discovering how thoroughly Sauron had infiltrated, corrupted, and prepared Middle-earth for conquest. But the archives of Minas Tirith were just the beginning. Because once Gandalf understands the scope of Sauron's long-term planning, he realizes he needs to verify these discoveries through multiple sources. The Grey Wizard doesn't just want evidence, he wants proof so overwhelming that even the White Council couldn't dismiss it. So year by year, Gandalf embarks on what can only be described as the most comprehensive intelligence operation in Middle-earth's history. He travels to Fornost, digging through the ruins of Arthedan's capital, looking for evidence of how the Witch King's campaign was coordinated with events in the south. He journeys to the Grey Havens, consulting with Círdan about patterns in orc movements that suddenly make horrifying sense when viewed as part of a centuries-long strategic plan. And with each verification, the picture becomes clearer and more terrifying. The fall of Arnor wasn't a separate conflict. It was the opening move in Sauron's plan to isolate Gondor. The plague that devastated the South Kingdom wasn't a natural disaster. Gandalf finds evidence of coordinated poisoning of water supplies, of diseased corpses deliberately placed in trade routes. Every random tragedy, every coincidental disaster, every moment when the forces of good seemed to suffer from simple bad luck, it was all orchestrated. Sauron had been playing a game of chess while his enemies thought they were just living their lives. But here's what makes Gandalf's investigation even more chilling. he starts finding evidence that Sauron's agents had been watching him. Personal records mentioning the Grey Wanderer asking unusual questions. Travel logs noting which roads Gandalf took, which inns he stayed at, which people he spoke with. The hunter realizes he's also been the hunted for decades. And this is where we need to understand something crucial about Gandalf's psychology during these years. Unlike Saruman, who approaches problems with the arrogance of superior intellect, or Radagast, who retreats into the comfort of nature, Gandalf has always been the Istari who connects with people, the Grey Pilgrim who walks among mortals, who shares their burdens, who finds hope in their courage. But now, for the first time in millennia, Gandalf is utterly alone with knowledge too terrible to share. Think about what that isolation does to a being whose entire mission is built on connection and fellowship. Every conversation becomes a performance. Every moment of apparent peace becomes a reminder of how much danger everyone is in without knowing it. Every smile from a hobbit, every laugh from a child, every moment of simple joy becomes both precious and heartbreaking, because Gandalf knows how close it all is to ending. Then the worst part. He can't even seek counsel from his fellow Istari. Saruman's responses to his subtle inquiries have grown increasingly evasive, and Gandalf starts to realize that the head of their order might not just be compromised, but might be actively working against him. Radagast has retreated so completely into his animal friends that he's become irrelevant to the larger struggle. The blue wizards vanished into the east long ago. Gandalf is conducting this investigation, not just alone, but while suspecting that his closest allies might be enemies. This is psychological warfare at the deepest level, and it's being waged against someone whose entire nature is built on trust, fellowship, and hope. For 17 years, Gandalf has to maintain his cover as the cheerful Grey Wanderer, while carrying the weight of civilizational collapse in his heart. But here's what makes Gandalf extraordinary. Instead of breaking under this pressure, he channels it into methodical, painstaking verification. Because Gandalf understands something that both Saruman and Sauron underestimate, the power of absolutely thorough preparation. Saruman rushes toward power, and Sauron assumes his long planning guarantees victory. Gandalf spends 17 years making sure that when he finally acts, he'll have every piece of evidence, every strategic insight, every possible advantage. It's not just detective work. It's the most comprehensive military intelligence operation in the history of Middle-earth, conducted by a single operative working under deep cover. The Nazgul hadn't just been hiding, they'd been recruiting. The mouth of Sauron wasn't just a messenger, he'd been building networks of spies and collaborators for decades. The corruption in Isengard wasn't recent. Saruman had been falling to shadow for years, while the wise council met in his very halls. You know how Gandalf has that haunted look throughout Lord of the Rings? How he sometimes stares into the distance with those ancient, troubled eyes? That's not the weight of cosmic responsibility. That's the look of someone who spent 17 years learning that everything he thought he knew about the enemy was wrong. It's the expression of a being who realized that while they'd been watching Sauron in Dol Guldur, he'd been watching them right back, learning their movements, studying their weaknesses, preparing. But here's where it gets truly chilling. In The Hunt for the Ring, Tolkien reveals that during this period, Gandalf discovered evidence of Sauron's agents operating throughout Eriador, Gondor, and even the Shire. Not new agents. Agents who had been in place for decades. Think about what that means. When Gandalf arrives in the Shire in The Hobbit, when he's choosing Bilbo for the quest, when he's making all those decisions that seem so wise and calculated, Sauron's spies were already there, watching, reporting. The enemy knew about Bilbo's ring before the wise did. They knew about the quest to Erebor. They knew Gandalf was growing suspicious, which means for years, the wizard they all trusted to know everything had been dancing to the Dark Lord's tune without realizing it. This is why Gandalf's face grew ever more troubled during those years. Every investigation led to more corruption. Every answered question revealed 10 more terrifying possibilities. Every attempt to map the scope of Sauron's influence only showed him how vast, how deep, how thorough the infiltration had become. And the worst part, he couldn't tell anyone, because the knowledge itself was a weapon that could break minds and shatter hope. How do you explain to the Council of the Wise that they've been outmaneuvered for decades? How do you tell the leaders of the Free Peoples that their enemies know more about them than they know about their enemies? But there's another layer to Gandalf's silence that's even more chilling. By year 10 of his investigation, Gandalf has realized that Sauron's intelligence network is so sophisticated that the Dark Lord probably knows Gandalf is investigating him. The very fact that the Grey Wizard is asking these questions, visiting these archives, consulting these sources, it's all being reported back to Barad-dûr. Which means Gandalf's investigation isn't just gathering intelligence, it's potentially accelerating Sauron's timeline. Every discovery Gandalf makes might be pushing the enemy to act sooner, to reveal himself before the Free Peoples are ready. This creates a horrifying paradox. The more Gandalf learns about how to defeat Sauron, the more likely he becomes to trigger the very conflict he's trying to prepare for. It's like defusing a bomb while knowing that every tool you use might set it off. And yet Gandalf continues, because he's realized something that makes his isolation worth bearing. If Sauron's victory was truly inevitable, the Dark Lord wouldn't need such an elaborate intelligence network. The very existence of all these spies, all this surveillance, all this careful manipulation proves that Sauron is still vulnerable. The enemy's strength is also his weakness. His need to know everything reveals that he doesn't know everything. His careful plans prove that improvisation might still defeat him. So during the later years of his investigation, Gandalf begins to shift from pure intelligence gathering to operational planning. He starts to identify not just what Sauron has done, but where the enemy might be vulnerable, which strongholds depend on specific supply lines, which alliances are built on fear rather than loyalty, which agents might be turned or at least neutralized. By year 15, Gandalf has compiled what amounts to the most comprehensive strategic analysis of evil's operations that Middle-earth has ever seen. He knows not just what Sauron has done, but how he thinks, how he plans, how he might react to unexpected challenges. And that's when Gandalf makes his most crucial realization. The War of the Ring won't be won by armies or wizards or even kings. It will be won by the very people Sauron has spent the least time studying. The small folk, the hobbits, the ones beneath the enemy's notice. Because in all his centuries of surveillance and intelligence gathering, Sauron has made one critical error. He's been watching the powerful, the obvious threats, the people who seem to matter in the grand scope of history. He's never bothered to study hobbits. By the time Gandalf returned to the Shire in 3018, he wasn't just bringing news about the ring. He was carrying 17 years of accumulated horror about how close Middle-earth had already come to falling. The War of the Ring wasn't a sudden crisis. It was the final move in a game Sauron had been playing and winning for decades. That's why Gandalf was so urgent about destroying the ring immediately. That's why he pushed so hard, so fast, with such desperate intensity. Because he knew something nobody else did. They weren't trying to prevent Sauron's return to power. They were trying to stop him from completing a conquest that was already 90% finished. So when you watch Gandalf in the movies, or read his words in the books, remember what's behind those ancient, troubled eyes. He's not just carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility. He's carrying 17 years of terrible knowledge about how thoroughly the enemy had prepared, how completely they'd been outmaneuvered, and how desperately close to victory the darkness had already come. The terrifying truth about Gandalf's missing years. He spent them learning that Middle-earth had been living on borrowed time for far longer than anyone realized, and only he knew how little time was left. That's not just the burden of wisdom. That's the weight of knowing that everything you've tried to protect was already half lost before you even understood the danger. The next time someone asks you why Gandalf seemed so worried all the time, you'll know the answer. He spent 17 years discovering that the war was already being lost, while everyone else still thought they were at peace. And if that doesn't give you a new appreciation for the weight this cosmic being carried in his mortal form, then you might not understand just how close we came to never having a Lord of the Rings at all, because those 17 missing years, they were the years when Middle-earth's fate hung by a thread that only Gandalf could see, and that thread was already starting to fray. That's the terrifying truth Tolkien hid from us, and now that you know it, you'll never read the story the same way again.